They called it a reassignment, a chance to recover. After the wildfire incident, the department decided I wasn't fit for high-risk zones anymore. Not unstable, just strained. That was the word they used. You seem strained. So they sent me to Greyside. Greyside National Preserve wasn't even on most maps. A patch of forest tucked far from any major road, bordered by low mountains and forgotten fire trails. They said it was peaceful, quiet. Barely any hikers, barely any incidents, perfect for someone who needed to breathe. That suited me just fine. I didn't want chaos. I didn't want people. After what happened last spring, I wasn't sure I could face another crew, another emergency, another death. They flew me in on a state helicopter, not because I was important, but because the preserve was too remote for standard transport. From above, the forest looked endless. Pale green and wet, wrapped in mist like it was still deciding if it wanted to be seen. No signs of trails, no campsites, just trees, miles and miles of them. A soft, undisturbed world. I thought it looked like a graveyard. The station was an old fire tower, retrofitted decades ago into a ranger post. Wood siding, tin roof, solar panels barely functional. Inside, it was dusty but warm and smelled like old pine and engine oil. I was alone, the only ranger assigned to Greyside. That first night, I unpacked slow. My duffel, my logbooks, a weather radio, my badge. Everything felt heavy. I moved from bag to drawer like I was underwater, still hearing the hiss of flame in my ears, still seeing the ash. It wasn't until I went to store my things in the bedroom that I noticed it. A second duffel already there, and a pair of boots by the door, mud dried into the soles. The previous ranger hadn't cleaned out. In fact, it looked like they left mid-shift. Clothes still folded on the cot, toothbrush still in a cup, coffee canister half full. There was even a note tacked to the fridge, just a grocery list. Eggs, rice, batteries. It was written in careful print, but the last line trailed off as if they'd been interrupted. I checked the logs. His name was Parker, Thomas Parker, transferred to Greyside 6 months ago. No resignation letter, no final entry, just silence. I radioed dispatch, asked for clarification. They told me he'd left due to voluntary resignation. I asked if they had a forwarding address. They didn't. No exit interview, no call, nothing, just a file marked closed. That didn't sit right. In this line of work, you finish things. You log your time, you leave clean, you don't vanish. I spent the next day cleaning the tower, dusting shelves, organizing maps, restocking the supply closet. Parker had kept things tidy. There were checklists, journals, backup flares, everything in its place. But still, it all felt paused, like he'd gone out for a short walk and just never came back. I found his jacket hanging behind the door. Wool-lined, heavy, too warm for summer patrols. I left it there. Something about touching it felt wrong. That night I couldn't sleep. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay in bed with the window cracked open. The fog moved slow between the trees, thick and low like it was crawling. I didn't hear crickets. I didn't hear birds. Just the occasional creak of wood, like the tower itself was settling into memory. At 3:17 a.m. I woke suddenly, not from a sound but from the absence of one. Even the wind had stopped. I walked to the main room and looked out through the observation window. The fog was dense now, like milk. I couldn't see the treetops. But I saw something else. Far below, on the southern edge of the clearing, I thought I saw a shape. Dark, unmoving, like a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was a tree, a trick of shadow and sleep, but I marked the spot on the map anyway. I started my first patrol the next morning. Trail 2 ran east for 3 miles, then looped back along a ridgeline. Nothing unusual. A few down branches, signs of deer, some black bear scat. I kept my radio close and my eyes forward. The trees were tall here, narrow, birch and fir and pine. The canopy filtered the sun into patches, thin and silver, the kind of light that makes everything feel underwater. I didn't see anyone. No hikers, no campers, no signs of recent fire. But the deeper I went, the more I felt watched. Not by animals, not even in the usual "I'm alone in the woods" way. It was a pressure, like the trees themselves were leaning in, not physically but with presence, attention. It built slowly, subtle, like static in the air. By the time I hit the halfway mark, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all morning. I took a break near the loop marker, sat on a moss-covered rock and drank from my thermos. And then I saw it. Another jacket, just like the one behind my door, caught on a low branch, too clean to have been there long. I climbed down and pulled it free. It was Parker's. His name was stitched into the collar. Why would he leave it out here? There was no note, no blood, just the jacket slightly damp with morning dew. I carried it back. That night I checked the logs again, tried to find anything Parker had written that could explain it. His last entry was dated 4 weeks before my arrival. He wrote about tree samples, about weather, about noise at night. That was the last line. The trees make noise when they think you're not listening. Nothing after that. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, let the weight of the room press in, let the forest whisper whatever it wanted. Greyside wasn't quiet. It was holding something in. And I'd just been given the keys. I found the binder on the 3rd morning. It was tucked beneath the radio console, sealed in a Ziploc sleeve. Thick, plastic-laminated pages, dated sections, no title on the cover, just a faint black smudge where a label might have been. I thought it would be a standard operating manual, maybe a few pages about wildlife procedures, fire safety, first aid, typical stuff they issue at every ranger station. And for the first few pages, that's exactly what it was. Bear identification charts, poisonous plants, emergency frequencies, evacuation routes in case of landslides or storms, a map with all 4 trails labeled in red marker, a note reminding me to check the flood gauge once a week. The tone was dry, bureaucratic, comfortingly dull. But then I reached the back third. That's where the binder changed. The tab read, Behavioral Protocols. That alone was odd. I'd never seen that term in a wilderness guide before. I flipped the page. The first line was printed in bold. The following rules are not legally required, but they are to be observed without exception. That made me pause. I read on. Rule 1. Do not enter the North Ridge Trail after dusk, no matter the reason. Rule 2. If you hear your name spoken in the forest, do not respond. Rule 3. The old birch grove by Trail 3 must not be approached. Avoid direct eye contact with the trees in that area. Rule 4. If a tree appears significantly closer than you remember, do not acknowledge it. Walk away calmly. Rule 5. Between 2:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m., avoid looking out the cabin's eastern window. Rule 6. If you find bark fragments in your bed or clothing, do not burn them. Bury them in salt. I sat there reading the list twice. There were 23 rules total. Some were vague, others were almost poetic in their wording. One warned against following music through the fog. Another simply read, Do not feed the silence. At first I laughed, quietly but still. It had to be a joke, something Parker wrote to mess with the next guy. Maybe he'd spent too long out here and started playing games. Cabin fever in slow motion. Still, something about the way the rules were typed. It wasn't casual. There were no jokes, no sarcasm. It felt clinical, like someone had documented observed phenomena and was trying desperately to create a system to survive them. I tried to shake it off, but a small part of me, something old and cautious, felt a chill. That night, I poured a cup of coffee and sat with the binder again. I made notes in my own logbook, not because I believed any of it, but because I wanted to keep track of what parts unnerved me most. Rule 3 especially, the one about the birch grove. There was a photograph taped beside it. A wide clearing filled with pale trees. Their bark was paper-thin and peeling like skin after a sunburn. The photo was grainy, but you could see a faint blur in the middle, like the light had warped. Underneath the photo, someone had written in pen, "They see you, they remember." I closed the binder and set it aside. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about the line, "If a tree appears significantly closer than you remember." What does that even mean? Trees don't move. They don't sneak up on you. It's absurd. And yet I remembered the shape I'd seen in the fog that first night, how it had vanished when I looked again. I told myself it had been nothing, but now I wasn't sure. What if I hadn't imagined it? What if it had been closer than it should have been? The next day, I walked Trail 3 with the binder in my pack. I wasn't hunting ghosts. I just wanted to see the grove for myself, prove to myself it was just a patch of trees like any other. It took me an hour to reach it. The forest grew quiet as I approached, not dead silent, just muffled, like the sound had been turned down. Then I saw them. The birches. They stood taller than the others, their trunks pale and peeling. Their limbs reached at strange angles like arms frozen mid-motion. The grove was oddly circular. No underbrush, no fallen branches, just a perfect ring of smooth white trees. I didn't go in. Not because of the rule, but because something in my chest tightened as I got closer, like walking into an old church or a locked room. A quiet pressure, heavy and wrong. I stood at the edge of the grove, staring. The trees did seem to be watching, not with eyes but with posture. Their limbs arched inward as if they leaned toward me, inviting, warning. I backed away. When I returned to the cabin, I placed the binder on the shelf beside the radio. But I didn't laugh this time. The rules were ridiculous, but they were here for a reason. And I wasn't so sure Parker had meant them as a joke. My first night in Greyside passed without incident. I logged temperatures, checked the radio relay, ran diagnostics on the backup generator. I drank too much coffee and sat awake longer than I needed to, staring out into the forest like it might try to blink, but nothing happened. By morning, I felt a little foolish for how tightly I'd clung to the rule binder, for how seriously I'd stared at that grove of birch trees. They were just trees. Pale, yes, a little eerie in their symmetry, but they hadn't moved. They hadn't watched me. Nothing in the woods had made a sound. That second night, I told myself to relax. The evening air was colder. A front had rolled in from the north, coating the trees in misty dew and thick, crawling fog. By the time I finished dinner, I could barely see past the edge of the clearing. The tower's windows had fogged over. Outside, the entire world looked like it had been erased with a pale brush. Around 11:30 p.m., I put on my jacket and grabbed the lantern for a routine fire watch. I wasn't expecting anything serious. Greyside hadn't had a burn event in years, but we still had to keep the records updated. Every other night, I was supposed to walk the eastern perimeter, check for fresh lightning strikes or smoke plumes. I made my way down the tower steps slowly. The fog wrapped around my ankles like it was alive. It was so thick it muffled my boots. Even the crunch of gravel sounded padded and distant. The woods felt close that night, not louder, just nearer, as if everything had stepped forward by an inch. I reached the eastern trailhead and began logging observations into my notepad. The treetops were barely visible, just a blur of black above the gray. That's when I heard the sound. A soft, rhythmic crunch, like something stepping lightly through underbrush. Slow, measured, not panicked, not animal-like. It was close, maybe 20 or 30 feet to my left, somewhere in the trees. I stopped writing. I held my breath and listened again. Nothing. just the sound of my own heartbeat ticking in my ears. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a falling branch. Fog plays tricks with sound, I knew that, but something about it felt off. It had cadence, footsteps, not animal movement. I turned in the direction of the sound and raised my lantern. Only fog stared back, thick pale choking the air. I stayed still for another few seconds, then I heard it again. Closer now. Another crunch, just one. And then whispering. It was faint, like hearing someone talk through a wall of glass. The sound slid between the trees, not quite directional, just around me. At first I couldn't make out the words. It was just the suggestion of speech, syllables without form. But then I caught something sharp, a shape, a single word that slipped through the static. My name. Whispered. Soft but clear. Spoken in a tone that mimicked familiarity, but didn't belong to any voice I knew. It wasn't echo. It wasn't imagination. It came from just outside the reach of my light. I spun toward it. Nothing. Just fog and the faint sway of pine needles. I turned back toward the station. The forest behind me was silent again. No more whispers. No more steps. But I didn't feel alone. I walked back fast. Not running, not yet, but my boots found rhythm on their own, the kind of pace your body sets when instinct is louder than reason. When I got back to the tower, I shut the door harder than necessary and bolted it, not because I thought something was following me, just because the silence outside felt too patient. I checked the barometer, turned off the exterior lights, and stood by the window watching the fog crawl against the glass. It moved slow, like smoke in zero gravity. I didn't hear anything else that night. But I kept thinking about that voice. How it didn't sound natural, how it didn't try to hide. It wanted me to hear it. And it had known my name. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed of walking in the fog. No tower, no trail, just white mist and the crunch of my own footsteps. In the dream, I kept hearing someone call to me, a voice from childhood, one I'd forgotten until now. When I woke up, the inside of the binder was open on my desk. I hadn't touched it since the previous night. I knew I hadn't. It was turned to Rule 2. If you hear your name spoken in the forest, do not respond. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I closed the binder and put it in the drawer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a deer. And it wasn't finished. The report came in just before noon. A hiker, middle-aged, nervous, came to the tower on foot, soaking wet from fog drizzle and visibly shaken. His name was Glenn. Said he and his golden retriever, Daisy, had been camping overnight near Trail 3, just north of Birch Hollow. He told me the dog chased a deer into the woods early that morning and hadn't returned. He called and called, waited hours. No bark, no sound. She was wearing a collar and was trained to return. Something felt off, he said. Wrong. I nodded and tried to stay calm for him. A missing pet wasn't unusual. Dogs got curious. They ran. Sometimes they came back. Sometimes they didn't. But what stuck with me was the way his voice shook, not with panic but with something colder, like he'd seen something he didn't know how to describe. He asked if we could organize a search party. I told him we didn't have a large enough team for that, but I'd hike out with him and cover the area. He hesitated, almost told me no. Then he nodded and said okay. We took the east trail and cut through the dense stretch leading toward Birch Hollow. Fog still hung low, brushing against our knees like it didn't want to lift. The air smelled wet, metallic, and oddly sweet, like decaying flowers. He walked quickly, eyes darting between trees, calling Daisy every few minutes. I followed behind, marking points on my GPS unit. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had already begun its descent. Light filtered through the trees in thin gold ribbons, too weak to burn off the mist. I recognized the area from the map, Birch Hollow. I hadn't planned on returning here so soon. The grove looked different in daylight, but not better. The birch trees stood too straight, too tall, their white bark peeling like faded paint. They seemed older than they should have been, like they remembered something I didn't. The fire pit was cold, sleeping bag rolled up neatly. No sign of struggle, but no sign of Daisy either. Glenn stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the hollow like it had offended him. "She chased the deer in that direction," he said, pointing. I followed his gaze. That's when I noticed it. I pulled out the GPS again and zoomed in. Something didn't match. According to the last aerial scan, Birch Hollow had a wide center, almost 50 feet from one side to the other. But standing there now, it was smaller, maybe 20 feet across at most. The trees were closer together, tighter, more crowded, as if they'd grown inward. Or moved. I looked up. Some of the birches leaned at odd angles. Their trunks curved not toward the sun, but toward the center of the clearing, like they'd been drawn inward by something magnetic, or like they'd been reaching. I told Glenn to stay near the camp and began circling the perimeter, scanning the underbrush. No paw prints, no fur, but several spots in the moss had strange indentations. Not tracks exactly, more like depressions, uneven, unnatural, as if something had rested there, not laid down but settled. When I reached the western edge of the hollow, I found a broken collar. Frayed leather strap, metal tag half bent. I flipped it over. Daisy etched in small caps. The surface was scratched, not chewed, not torn, scratched. Thin, jagged lines like someone had dragged it across stone or bark. I called out to Glenn. He jogged over, saw the collar, and dropped to his knees. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally stood, his hands were shaking. I told him we'd keep looking, but I knew he didn't believe she was coming back. Neither did I. We searched until dusk, and I kept watching the trees. They were closer by the time we left. I didn't say anything. Didn't want to scare him more than he already was. We hiked back to the trailhead in near silence. The forest was still. Too still. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. When we reached the fork near Trail 2, Glenn turned to me. "There was something else," he said, voice low. "Before Daisy ran, before the deer showed up, I heard something." "What kind of something?" I asked. He looked at the ground. It was like talking, not loud, just low, not in English, not in any language really, just rhythm like chanting. I thought it was the wind, but now I'm not sure. I didn't respond. I couldn't. When we parted ways, I handed him a copy of the ranger station number and told him I'd follow up. He nodded but didn't say goodbye. That night, I reviewed the GPS logs. Coordinates from the hollow confirmed it. The distance between tree markers had shortened. Not by much, but enough. At least 30 feet of space had been swallowed. Or shifted. The trees had moved. And I didn't know how to explain it. I flipped open the rule binder again. Skimmed through until I found Rule 4. If a tree appears significantly closer than you remember, do not acknowledge it. Walk away calmly. I closed the binder. And I started locking the cabin door at night. Not because of people, but because something in the woods had shifted. And I could feel it watching. I didn't set out to break a rule. In fact, that entire day I've been trying to follow them more carefully. After Birch Hollow, after the shifting trees and the missing dog, the rules no longer felt like jokes. They felt like warnings. Maybe even confessions from someone who survived long enough to write them down. But fear has a way of knotting itself into curiosity, and curiosity out here is dangerous. The North Ridge Trail was the one place the binder had been most explicit about. Do not enter after dusk. No exceptions, but I convinced myself it would be fine to check the weather instrument station near the ridge. It was a quick task, 15 minutes at most, and I still had plenty of daylight left. At least, that's what I told myself. I headed out around 5:30 p.m., walking fast. The fog wasn't thick yet. The air smelled like rain that would never fall. As I climbed higher, the wind picked up, brushing cold fingers across my face. By the time I reached the ridge overlook, the sun had already slipped behind a bank of dark clouds. The treetops below swayed in slow, unsettling patterns, not chaotic like a storm, more like breathing, a long inhale, a long exhale. Thousands of tree crowns moving in eerie unison, rising and falling as if the forest itself lived. The sight froze me where I stood. I should have left immediately. I should have turned around the second the sun dipped behind those clouds, but something about the rhythmic motion held me still. Hypnotic, wrong, beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. I checked the sensors with trembling hands, logged the humidity levels, reset the barometric reader. When I looked up, the sky had darkened to deep blue and indigo. Dusk had come faster than it should have. The ridge felt higher than before, the air heavier. I reached for my flashlight. It flickered. A nervous breath escaped me. I hit the casing once with my palm. The light steadied, but only slightly. The beam stretched thin and pale across the rocks. Then the trees stopped moving. All at once, every treetop below vanished into stillness, as if something had placed a hand over the forest and pressed firmly, commanding silence. I swallowed hard. The air grew colder around me, dense, almost physical, like the atmosphere tightened, compressing my ribs. I took one step back. That was when I heard it. A scrape. Soft, dry, like weathered bark dragged lightly across stone. I turned slowly, light trembling in my hand. The ridge behind me was empty. Another scrape. Closer. Not wind, not branches, something moving with intention, something that knew exactly how to approach. I lifted the flashlight again. The beam flickered harder, dancing between shadows and fog. My breath formed thin clouds in front of me. Then something brushed against the back of my arm. Dry wooden, textured like old bark. I jerked away so fast I lost my footing and stumbled. My flashlight hit the ground and spun, casting wild arcs of light. My heart hammered against my ribs. There was nothing behind me. Nothing visible. But the air shifted in a way I had felt before. The same presence from that night near the Eastern Trail. The same quiet attention, watching, approaching, testing the space between us. I didn't think. I ran. I knew I wasn't supposed to. I knew the binder had warned against reacting to the forest in fear, but instinct drowned everything out. I sprinted down the ridge path, boots slamming the dirt, breath ripping from my throat. The fog thickened around me as if rising to embrace the chase. Every step echoed in unnatural ways, bouncing, folding, losing direction. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across the trunks, revealing glimpses of twisted bark and pale branches that looked closer each time the light caught them. I kept running. Something kept pace behind me. Not on the trail, in the trees, moving parallel, fast, too fast for anything with roots, but heavy enough that I felt it through the ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Branches shifted overhead. Leaves rustled in strange, clipped rhythms. Every sound pushed me harder, shoved panic deeper into my lungs. By the time I reached the lower trail, my legs shook. My throat burned. The tower's light was barely visible through the fog, but it was enough to anchor me. I didn't stop running until I reached the wooden steps. I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping. Silence filled the room. Not calm silence. The kind of silence that feels like teeth being clenched. I turned on every light inside the station and stood still until my breathing slowed. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. After several minutes, I finally walked to the desk. The binder sat there. Open. I hadn't left it open. And the page it had been turned to was different. A rule I hadn't seen before. One that wasn't in the earlier sections. Rule 12. Printed in the same precise typeface as the others, but the edges of the page were fresher, almost too clean. Rule 12. Never run through the forest after dark. They don't like chase. My stomach constricted as I read it again. The word hit harder than the rule itself. There was no human author in that phrasing, no bureaucratic tone, no scientific caution. The rule sounded like advice from someone who had been hunted, someone who learned what the forest wanted, someone who didn't make it out. My hands tightened on the binder. I thought about the footsteps beside me in the trees, the brush against my arm, the way the treetops had moved together, breathing one moment and holding still the next. The forest had reacted to me. It had watched me break the rule, and it had chased me. I placed the binder back on the desk gently, almost respectfully, and backed away. For the first time since arriving at Greyside, I felt something I couldn't rationalize, something I couldn't log or record as simple environmental effects. Fear. Not the kind that rises quickly and burns out, not panic. This was the slow, deep kind, the kind that plants itself in your spine and waits, the kind that feels like the beginning of a story I didn't want to be part of. And somewhere outside, past the edge of the fog, something moved. Not loudly, not threatening, just enough to remind me that the forest knew I had run. And it wasn't finished. It started with the sound of something hollow beneath my boot. A low, dull thunk. I was cleaning the corner beneath the cot, sweeping dust and dead pine needles into a pile, when the broomstick knocked against a board that echoed wrong. Different resonance. Not solid, covered in years of grime and trail dust, but it gave slightly under pressure. I crouched, pulled my knife from my belt, and pried up the edge of the plank. Beneath it was a gap, a shallow crawlspace between the cabin floor and the cold earth below, barely enough room to fit my arm. The smell that rose up was old and stale, like dried-out leather and mildew. Tucked into the space was a single item, wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas, protected, preserved. I pulled it out. A journal, handmade, thick paper bound with leather twine. The edges curled with moisture damage, but the ink had held. There was no name on the cover, but I knew whose it was. Thomas Parker, the ranger before me. I sat down at the desk and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat at first, controlled, clear, small block letters. Day 1 arrived at Greyside. Place is quiet. Fog rolls in around 4 every afternoon. Cold but manageable. Good assignment for the next 6 months. Might finally finish that book I started. The next few entries were routine. Notes about patrols, inventory checks, 1 or 2 mentions of animal sightings. Coyote, elk, black bear far off the west ridge. He seemed calm, bored even. Then about 20 pages in, things began to shift. Day 18. Hiker reported a tree in a different spot than earlier. Brushed it off, but when I double-checked the marker stones, the clearing did seem smaller. No wind damage, no signs of falling trees, just denser. He drew a sketch, a rough map of the trail loop with sections marked in red, small circles labeled zone shift and growth swell. One note in the margin read, trees closer after fog. I flipped ahead. The maps grew more detailed. He was tracking tree lines by hand, counting trunks, logging distances with GPS and tape measures. Day 26, North Ridge felt wrong today. Same trail, same trees, but the sky felt lower. Time moved strange. Light dimmed too fast, heard something, not animal, not weather. Day 27, dreams started. First night was just static. Second was whispering. I recognized a voice. My mother, but she's been gone for years. Day 30, trees breathe when I'm not looking. I hear it now, subtle, wet. The writing was still neat, but there were small tremors in the letters, tiny hesitations. By page 50, the journal had changed. He'd created a full map of Greyside with sections labeled cold zones, neutral, and hot. Hot zones included Birch Hollow, the North Ridge Trail, and a section near the East Creek I hadn't patrolled yet. He began naming the groves. The Leaners, the Bone Circle, the Crooked Line. It was obsessive, detailed, scientific in method but unhinged in tone. He recorded bark samples, described chemical traces he couldn't explain. One entry said, "The sap crystallizes differently here. Not amber, not resin, it flakes like glass. Bleeds sweet, attracts nothing." Another, "The trees aren't alive in the normal way. They don't rot, they don't host insects. No nests, no fungi, nothing grows on them. Everything avoids them, except me." Page after page, each entry spiraling further. He started talking about pressure headaches that came only in certain groves, how the sound changed in those places, how he could feel the trees listening, not just observing, listening. Then the dreams escalated. Day 44, I woke with dirt under my nails, no memory of digging. My hands smelled like pine, but not our pine, sour, burnt. Day 45, bark imprints on my ribs, as if something held me, not bruises, not scratches, just the pattern. He began repeating words in the margins, phrases written in loops, spiraling into the corners of the page. They remember. They wait until you turn. Closer every time. One line appeared more than once, always underlined, always in red. They want to be known. I felt something tighten in my chest as I kept reading. He stopped labeling the days. The entries lost sequence. Thoughts broke apart. A few pages were filled only with ink smears and half-written words. Then came the final page. It held just one sentence. Written in shaky, uneven script, a different pen, darker ink. They are learning my name. That was it. No signature. No goodbye. No final map. Just that sentence. And below it, faint but visible, were fingerprints. Not ink, not dirt. Zap. Dark and sticky, dried into the fibers of the paper, still faintly scented, sweet like rotten flowers. I closed the journal and sat in silence. The cabin creaked softly behind me. The trees outside brushed lightly against the window pane. I looked out and saw nothing. But I felt something. An attention. As if reading his words had peeled something open, woken something up. I placed the journal in the drawer with the binder. And for the first time since arriving, I whispered my own name out loud. Just to hear it. Just to remember it still belonged to me. Because if Parker was right, something out there was learning it too. And once it knew it, I wasn't sure it would give it back. I needed proof. Not because I doubted myself, but because I had no one else to trust. After reading Parker's journal, I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Every creak in the wood, every groan in the pipes, every breeze through the trees felt like another whisper I couldn't quite hear. So I decided to test it, document it. If the forest was moving, shifting, reacting the way Parker described, I'd catch it. That was the plan. I dug through the supply closet and pulled out every piece of surveillance gear we had. Trail cams, 12 in total, plus 4 more I had brought from my last post. Infrared capable, motion triggered with low-light lenses and 32 gig SD cards, enough to cover all known hot zones and several control areas. I mounted them myself, one on the North Ridge path, 2 facing the Birch Hollow perimeter, 1 above the Crooked Line Grove. The rest I placed at random across neutral sections of the preserve, areas where nothing strange had happened, at least not yet. Each camera had a timestamp overlay, I recorded the coordinates and logged the install time down to the minute. Everything was methodical, clean, no room for doubt. Then I waited. For the first 2 nights, nothing. No significant motion triggers, no anomalies, just footage of fog rolling past empty trees, squirrels darting across trails, the occasional bird flitting between branches. I started to think maybe I was chasing ghosts after all. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. I woke to a buzzing sound, subtle, low frequency. It came from the monitor setup I'd wired into the corner of the cabin. Each feed displayed in sequence on a small screen. They were supposed to auto-cycle every 30 seconds. But the screen was frozen. One image static. Me, standing in front of Cam 4, the one mounted facing the Birch Hollow Trail. I stared into the lens, eyes wide, shoulders slack, no flashlight, no jacket, just a blank expression, staring. I sat there watching myself on loop. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. I checked the time. It was 4:02 a.m. I had no memory of leaving the cabin. No memory of walking there. No mud on my boots, no sign I'd gone anywhere. I pulled the SD card from the device and reviewed the footage on my laptop. One frame, over an hour long. Not a video, a single still held in place as if time itself had stopped recording. The motion log showed no interruptions. It hadn't detected movement, it had simply stopped as soon as I appeared in frame. None of the other cameras triggered that night. Not one. The next morning I hiked out to Cam 4. It was still mounted properly, untouched. No signs of tampering, but the ground nearby was disturbed. Light indentations in the moss, like footsteps but shallow, almost careful. And on the camera casing itself, I found something sticky. Zap. Dark, dried into the grooves around the lens. It wasn't there when I mounted it. That night I checked the feeds again. Cam 2 was looping, jumping back 5 seconds, over and over, like a needle skipping on a vinyl record. I checked the file. The footage glitched, 5-second loop. A tree in frame seemed to twitch slightly with each jump, shift a little closer. Only when I paused the video frame by frame did I realize the tree wasn't a tree at all. The bark was too smooth, too symmetrical, no branches, no leaves. Just a shape. Tall, still, waiting. I ejected the card and shut down the monitor. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I turned off the lights, sat in silence. That was when I smelled it. Sweetness. Not perfume, not flowers. Thicker, heavier. Rotting sap. The scent drifted through the room like a memory. It filled the corners of the cabin. It coated the inside of my nose. I could taste it in the back of my throat. I walked to the sink and checked the drains. Clean. Checked the window seals. Closed. Still, the scent grew stronger. I opened the storage closet and froze. The trail cam packaging was on the floor, torn open, wet with something amber-colored, viscous, slow dripping. On the inside of the closet door, someone had pressed a handprint into the wood. Not paint. Zap. 5 long fingers, too long, impossibly long. The stain was fresh. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the desk with the binder open to Rule 12 and Parker's journal beside me. I looked through the footage again, frame by frame, cam by cam. Most of them were fine, but 3 of them had file corruption that didn't make sense. They weren't damaged, just overwritten. A single frame repeated hundreds of times, always the same one. Me standing in the forest, always in a different spot. Always staring at the camera, always alone. But I hadn't been there. Not physically, not consciously, unless something else had worn my face. Or maybe part of me had started slipping. Either way, The cameras weren't watching the forest anymore. The forest was watching me. And now it had pictures. It was marked on Parker's hand-drawn map, circled 3 times in red ink, labeled with a single word. Watching. No other name, no elevation data, no coordinates, just an arrow pointing toward a northern stretch I hadn't yet patrolled, far beyond the designated trails. That morning I told myself I'd only scout the area from a distance. No deep push, no rule breaking, just observation. I packed light, a flashlight, a flask of water, the map, and a flare gun. I left the cameras behind. The fog was thin that day. The sun hung pale above the canopy, barely warming the forest floor. My boots crunched through a bed of pine needles and leaf mulch as I moved beyond Trail 4, cutting northwest. The deeper I walked, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to grow tired, giving up somewhere behind me. I checked the map often, tracing Parker's red ink. Each step forward felt wrong, not in the physical sense, but in the way certain places carry weight. Like a courtroom, like a hospital hallway, like a grave that hasn't been filled yet. By the time I reached the grove, the sun had begun to slip behind the trees. I knew it was the right place immediately. The trees there leaned unnaturally inward, their trunks bending as if pulled by gravity toward a single unseen point. Their bark was smoother than anything I'd seen in Greyside. Gray-white, not birch, not pine, something in between. The roots crawled above the soil, twisted and gnarled like reaching fingers. Some of them had grown over each other, forming shapes that looked almost human. Knees, elbows, ribs. The grove was nearly circular, perfect in a way that nature never is. I didn't step inside. I stood at the edge and watched. The light dimmed faster than it should have. Not like sunset, more like a curtain had been drawn over the sky. I checked my watch. It was only 6:12 p.m. Still early, but the shadows moved like it was later. Longer, heavier. Something brushed against the back of my thoughts, a pressure like someone trying to whisper just beneath the range of hearing. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration in my skull. The trees stood still, but I couldn't shake the feeling they were leaning further. Their branches weren't swaying. They were curling, reaching. I stepped backward. The wind picked up, sudden, sharp cold. It hissed between the trunks like breath pulled through teeth. I turned to leave. The path behind me was gone. Not overgrown, not blocked. Gone. In its place was more forest, trees I didn't recognize, stones in unfamiliar patterns, no footprints, no markers, just more. I spun slowly in place, trying to stay calm. Picked a direction, walked. 10 minutes later, I returned to the same grove. Same leaning trees, same exposed roots. I tried another path. And again, the same. I was circling, not by choice. I could feel the pressure rising around me, like the grove wasn't letting me go. Not until it had what it wanted. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the invisible line between the leaning trunks, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in white clouds. The soil underfoot was spongy, soft, damp, like walking on soaked paper. The center of the grove was empty. No fallen trees, no leaves, just bare ground, smooth and pale. I stood in the middle and turned in a slow circle. All the trees now leaned toward me. Their branches arched above like a canopy, forming a dome, a cage. The air changed. It grew thicker, not humid, dense. I heard something then. Not words, not voices. A collective murmur. Whispers without mouths. A language I didn't know, but that still scraped across the inside of my brain like something trying to rewrite the way I thought. My knees buckled. I dropped to the ground and gripped the soil. It pulsed. Not metaphorically. It pulsed once like a heartbeat. I stood stumbling and staggered back toward the grove's edge. The trees didn't move, but I swear they adjusted. Their limbs lowered slightly, just enough to brush against my shoulders as I passed, like parting curtains or hands. The moment I crossed back out of the circle, the fog broke. The light returned. I found the trail again, less than 20 feet away, as if it had never disappeared at all. I didn't run, not because I wasn't afraid, because I remembered Rule 12. They don't like chase. I walked briskly, straight-backed, eyes forward. I didn't speak, didn't look back. Not once. When I reached the tower, the sun was gone. I climbed the steps, locked the door behind me, and went straight to the drawer. I opened Parker's journal again, flipping until I found the section about the grove. His entry was short. The grove watches, don't stay in the center, don't speak inside it, it listens, it remembers, it dreams. I sat back, hands trembling. Outside, the fog rolled in again, silent and slow. I didn't turn on the lights. Didn't eat. I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, trying not to remember the feeling of the soil pooling beneath my palms, trying not to hear the whispering in the quiet. And as I closed my eyes, something pressed against the cabin wall. A soft touch, almost like bark, almost like fingers, and the faintest sound carried by the night wind. A breath that wasn't mine. I couldn't stop thinking about the grove. Even in daylight, the memory sat behind my eyes. The inward lean of the trees, the way the earth had pulsed under my hands, that faint whispering that bypassed my ears and went straight into my head. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't new, and it wasn't random. Parker had known. The more I read through his journal, the more it became clear that he hadn't simply abandoned his post. He documented things with too much care, too much fear, too much obsession. People don't disappear like that without leaving some kind of trace. So I called dispatch again. I gave them the ranger's full name, Thomas Parker, badge number 71812, reassigned to Greyside 6 months before I arrived. I asked for his exit paperwork, medical leave forms, resignation letter, anything. The woman on the other end of the line went silent for a moment. Then she said, "I don't see anything like that here." I waited. She clicked through files, typed something, paused again. "We have him listed as inactive," she said finally. "No exit interview, no transfer out, no forwarding address." "Marked inactive by who?" "No signature," she said. "Just a timestamp 3 months ago, system entry only." "Is he dead?" "No death certificate, no report." She sounded confused. I didn't respond, just thanked her and ended the call. Inactive, not dead, not transferred, not missing, just paused. Like he had never left, but didn't count anymore. That night, I tore the cabin apart. Not out of panic, out of need. I knew there had to be more, something else Parker left behind, something he didn't want found easily. I searched under floorboards again, checked inside vent covers, ripped open the lining of the old ranger coat still hanging behind the door. Nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed the mirror above the sink. It was bolted to the wall but slightly loose in the top right corner. I pried it gently with a screwdriver. It shifted, popped, and leaned forward just enough to let something slide free. A photograph. Old curled edges, Polaroid style, glossy but faded. I expected to see Parker, maybe a photo of him with other rangers, a clue about where he'd gone. But it wasn't a person. It was a tree. Just one. Its trunk was wider than any I'd seen in the preserve. Pale bark with a deep vertical split running through the center. The gap was dark, almost black. Something was inside it. Not clearly visible, just a shape, human-sized, curled forward. Like it was resting. Or sleeping. I held the photo closer. My fingers trembled slightly as I tilted it in the light. There was detail if you looked hard enough. The curve of a shoulder, a jawline, a patch of cloth ranger green. Not a shadow, not pareidolia. Something was in that tree. The more I stared, the more certain I became. It was him, Thomas Parker, or what was left of him. I flipped the photo over. One word was written in pencil. Waiting. I sat at the table, photo in hand, the tower quiet around me. I thought about the inactive status in the system. No record of him ever leaving. No paperwork, just a digital timestamp, clean, forgettable. Like someone had pressed a key and erased him. Not from memory, just from responsibility, from accountability, from reality. I looked at the photograph again. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a promise that whatever this place was, whatever rules governed Greyside, it didn't let you go. It absorbed you, one slow breath at a time, until you stopped fighting and simply became part of it. That's what Parker had been documenting. Not hauntings, not anomalies, a process. I placed the photo beside the journal and stared at both for a long time. Then I walked to the window and looked out across the clearing. The forest stood still, but not silent. Never silent. And deep among the trees, something waited. Not buried, not gone. Just watching. Just listening. Just learning. It was late morning when the call came through. Dispatch informed me 2 hikers were overdue on Trail 6. A man and a woman, couple in their late 20s, both experienced, both familiar with the park. They had checked in 2 days prior and were expected back last night. No one had heard from them. Trail 6 wasn't part of my usual rotation. It wound west through the lower ridgeline and cut close to one of the areas Parker had marked in red. I hadn't patrolled it in over a week. I packed supplies, clipped on my radio, and joined the search. 3 others met me at the south trailhead, 1 ranger from a neighboring post and 2 volunteers from the town just beyond the ridge. We split into pairs and fanned out. The first hour was uneventful. The path was clear if damp, no signs of wildlife, no debris, no broken branches or gear, nothing left behind. Until we found the first one. He was curled beneath the exposed roots of a fallen tree just off the main path, body wedged tight between knotted limbs. At first, I thought he was dead. Then he blinked. Slow blank. His clothes were muddy but intact. No blood, no broken bones. His hands were curled loosely against his chest like he'd been sleeping in fetal position. But his eyes, they were open too wide, glassy, unfocused. He didn't respond to his name. Didn't flinch when we called out, when we touched his shoulder. Then softly, like air leaking through a crack in the wall, he began to speak. One word. Over and over. Planted. Each time he said it, his lips barely moved, like the word was being exhaled, not spoken, like it wasn't for us. The medic checked him over. No injuries, no dehydration, but his pupils were slow, his pulse faint. It was as if someone had shut off part of him. We wrapped him in a blanket and radioed for evac support. They said it would be 2 hours. I stayed with him while the others continued the search. I tried to ask him questions. What happened, where the woman was, if they'd gotten lost, if they ate something strange. No response. Just that word, whispered every few minutes. Planted. I looked around. The roots he'd been found beneath were strange, too smooth, not splintered the way a fallen tree should be, and the soil, there was no dirt packed under his nails, no signs he'd clawed his way in. It was like the earth had opened around him, wrapped him gently, or grown to fit him. 20 minutes later, one of the searchers radioed in. They'd found something. Not the woman. A depression in the ground, farther up the trail. When I arrived, I didn't speak, couldn't. The earth had folded in, literally. A perfect oval in the middle of the path, about the length of a person, maybe 5 feet deep. No claw marks, no drag trails, no animal tracks. Just a smooth hollow, like something had sunk straight into the earth without struggle. Or been absorbed. We searched around the area. No blood, no belongings, no prints. It looked like a grave, but no one had dug it. The woman was never found. Her name was Celia. I remember that clearly because later, I said it out loud several times, standing at the edge of the hollow. She didn't answer. I knew she wouldn't. When we hiked the survivor back to the trailhead, he stopped muttering, went limp, didn't blink. I told myself he was in shock. But part of me believed something had been taken from him, something internal. Whatever made him a person had been drained and replaced with silence. Later, I helped process his gear: backpack, flashlight, GPS unit. The flashlight was intact, batteries full. But the GPS, it was blank. No stored data. Not wiped, just empty, like it had never been turned on. That night, I returned to the tower and stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. The trees swayed softly. Nothing unusual. But in the hush between the wind and my own breath, I could almost hear it again. That single word. Planted. Like a seed. Or a warning. Or a transformation. I walked back inside and opened the binder. There was no rule about Trail 6. No note. But Parker's map, his hand-drawn one, I'd pinned it beside the desk a few days ago. I looked closer. The area near the hollow had been marked with 3 red dots. Beside it in faint pencil. Soil too soft, takes weight, doesn't return. He'd known. He'd seen something. Maybe not this exact event, but something like it. A pattern, a behavior. This forest didn't just watch. It responded. Not with violence, not always. But with hunger. And now I had seen what it did when it decided to keep something. It didn't leave behind bones. It didn't leave behind blood. It left a space. A hollow. And a man who repeated a word like it wasn't his anymore. Like it had been placed inside him. I had begun recording everything. I kept the audio device clipped to my chest on every patrol, even when I didn't speak, even when I wasn't supposed to be out. I logged hours of silence, hours of fog, hours of my own breath moving between trees that didn't sway unless they wanted to. I wasn't looking for words, just proof, any irregularity, any pattern, something beyond photographs and vanishing paths, something that could be played back, rewound, shared. The old growth line was the last place I hadn't yet monitored. North of Trail 2, the trees there were thicker, older, with trunks so wide it would take 3 people to wrap around one. Parker had marked that section with faint circles on his map, but hadn't left any notes. That morning, I went alone. The forest was still, no wind, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring after too long. I placed the recorder on a stump in the center of a natural clearing and stepped back. I waited there for nearly an hour. Nothing happened. No birds, no animals, no movement, just the forest breathing slow beneath a pale sky. Eventually, I took the recorder, hiked back and didn't think much of it. That night, I listened. The playback began as expected, ambient static, faint wind, the occasional creak of branches. I listened to my own footsteps fading as I stepped away from the device. Then nothing for 20 minutes. Then something changed. At first it was low, like pressure not sound. A low vibration almost below the threshold of hearing. A soft hum rising gently. Then layered beneath it came texture, groaning. The faint rasp of bark shifting against bark, like trees were leaning against each other, grinding softly, rearranging themselves while no one watched. I turned the volume up. That's when I heard it. A voice. Not human. It said my name. Not shouted, not spoken, stated. Dragged through the recording like bark dragged over stone, like wind tearing through hollow trunks. It sounded like every tree had said it at once, followed by silence. Then laughter. It wasn't a joyful sound. It wasn't manic. It was dry, low, multiplying. First one voice, then two, then more, echoing over each other in unnatural layers. Laughter with no breath behind it, no lungs, no face. Laughter like the cracking of old wood under snow, like the echo of roots pulling tighter in the earth. I paused the recording. My hands were sweating. I rewound it and played it again. Same thing. My name. The laughter. And then, just before the recording ended, a sound I hadn't noticed before. Like something exhaling slowly, right next to the mic. A single word buried in static. Not English. Not anything I could define. But it knew me. The room was cold when I took off the headphones. Outside, the wind had picked up. I hadn't noticed. I looked at the recorder in my hand and realized my name didn't feel like mine anymore. Not after hearing it said that way. Not after hearing something speak it as if it had been watching me long before I arrived. At dawn, I went back to the old growth line. I had to see if anything had changed. And it had. The clearing was different. The stump I'd placed the recorder on was gone. Not broken, not burned. Gone. In its place was a young sapling, maybe 2 feet tall, still fresh, still soft. Its bark was wet like it had just finished growing. The trees around it looked younger too. Their trunks thinner. Their moss fresher. The canopy overhead didn't look like it had the day before. It looked like a new version of an old place. As if the forest had reset itself. I stood there for a long time, not moving. The trees weren't threatening, but they were aware. I could feel them focusing inward. Not toward me, toward the sapling, like they were protecting it, or listening to it. I stepped back, and again, careful not to turn my back until I reached the edge of the growth line. When I got back to the tower, I archived the recording on a separate drive. But I didn't listen to it again. Not yet. Something had spoken my name. And now the forest looked different where I had been. Younger. Rewritten. I didn't know what that meant. But I knew I had been acknowledged. And that meant something had changed. For good. I needed to be wrong. After everything I'd seen, Parker's journal, the missing hikers, the laughing voice on the recorder, I still wanted to believe there was an explanation. Some rational tether I could hold onto before the whole thing pulled me under. So I came up with a theory. The trees weren't real. Not in the traditional sense. Maybe they weren't trees at all. Maybe they were constructs, planted or placed, something engineered, positioned to observe, to control. If I could prove that, then maybe I could reverse engineer the madness, pull the curtain back. So I started digging. The first site I chose was a clearing off Trail 3 where I'd felt the trees lean closest. I brought a shovel, a hatchet, and a field knife. No recorder, no map. I didn't want this part to feel like a mission. I wanted it to feel like proof. The tree I picked was tall, thin. Its bark was a strange shade between birch and ash, but smooth all over. No markings, no moss, no insects. I pressed a palm to it. It was cold. Not the chill of shadow or weather, cold like stone. I began digging at the base. The soil gave way easily at first. Soft loam and rotting leaves, dry needles. But then, just 4 inches down, it turned strange. Hard, pale. I expected to hit roots, spidery gnarled, reaching downward like they always do, but there were none. No taproot, no feeder roots, nothing. Just more of the trunk. The bark continued underground for another foot. Same smooth surface, same cold feel. I dug wider. Still nothing. I used the hatchet to chip into the base. No sap, no rings, no living tissue beneath the bark. Just a dull gray mass, compact, dense. I kept going. My hands blistered, my back ached. Eventually, I struck stone, too flat to be natural. The tree had ended, just ended, like a post driven into a concrete block. It wasn't growing. It had been placed. I sat down in the dirt, panting. It was dead, or rather, it had never been alive. I stared at the thing in front of me and realized it had never swayed. Not once, not even in wind. I'd walked past it dozens of times. It had never dropped leaves, never hosted birds, never cast the right kind of shadow. I looked up. All around me, trees just like it stood still. Watching. I tried to imagine what they saw. How long they had stood there, what they were waiting for. Or who. The next tree I dug around was smaller. Same result. No roots, just a surface illusion of bark and then hard, lifeless mass beneath. No decay, no insects, no ecosystem. Even the soil around them was wrong, too clean. No worms, no beetles, no fungal networks, just sterile dirt. Back at the tower, I flipped through the ecology manuals I'd brought with me. Everything I knew about forests, about how they live, grow, and die, none of it applied here. These weren't trees. They were impressions of trees, props, placed by something that understood the shape, but not the function. A mimicry of nature, not for disguise, but for study. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. My body was sore, my hands scraped raw, dirt still clung under my nails. But I didn't feel tired. I felt observed, not in the paranoid way. In the patient way, like something was letting me peel back the layers just enough to see the edge of the truth, just enough to understand I was far too late. I opened Parker's journal one more time, found a page I'd skimmed too quickly before. There in the center, written with dark ink and underlined once, "If they are not planted, then what are we?" The sentence didn't make sense the first time I read it. Now it sat differently. He wasn't just talking about the trees. He was questioning the boundaries, where the observation ends and the subject begins. I closed the book and walked to the window. The forest outside was still. No movement, no wind. But I could feel the tension, like something just beneath the surface had shifted. And I understood, finally, that I wasn't studying the woods anymore. They were studying me. It began with the siren, a shrill, rising wail that jolted me awake just after 2 a.m. My emergency radio lit up with flashing red indicators, the weather alert system screaming across every frequency. The screen scrolled a single message over and over. Severe weather warning, wind event, take shelter immediately. I jumped from the cot, heart pounding, and stared out the window. The sky was black, no stars, no moon. The fog was thicker than ever, pressed tight against the glass. I'd seen storms roll in before. Wind shears that tore branches from trunks, flash floods that roared through valleys. You can feel real storms in your chest before they arrive, electric, charged. This felt different. I checked my phone. No signal. Every screen in the station displayed the same warning, repeating, pounding. Take shelter immediately. I moved fast, pulled the metal storm shutters down over the windows, secured the latches, locked the doors. I checked the backup generator, filled the kettle, and loaded the flare gun. I followed every protocol. Then I waited. And waited. But the storm never came. No wind, no thunder, no rain, only fog. Thick and crawling, sliding over the grass like a living thing. It wrapped the base of the tower, blotting out the clearing entirely. I couldn't see more than 5 feet beyond the glass. The siren stopped at 2:41 a.m. The radios went dead at the same time. No signal. No error message. Just silence. I stood at the observation window, flashlight in hand, watching the fog press in tighter. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A movement, barely a shift. But it came again. A shape in the distance, then another. Silhouettes. They looked like trees, but not the ones rooted near the clearing. These were thinner, closer together, their trunks too straight, too narrow, their angles wrong. I counted 3 at first, then 5, then 7. Each time I blinked, more appeared. They weren't swaying in the breeze. There was no breeze. They were reaching. Their limbs bent downward, fingers dragging toward the soil, scraping across the fog in slow, deliberate arcs. I backed away from the glass. My breath caught. My ears rang with the sudden absence of noise. Then I saw one move. Not the wind swaying it, not a trick of the eyes. It stepped, an entire trunk shifting forward a full foot. No sound, no cracking, just a silent advance. The one beside it followed, and the one behind that. The ground didn't quake, the structure didn't groan, but the tower felt it. A presence pressing upward from the roots, like something had decided to come closer. Not fast, not aggressive, just patient. Persistent. I killed the lights, sat on the floor, waited. The fog outside grew brighter, reflecting pale light from nowhere, like moonlight through water, but the moon wasn't visible. I heard a sound against the wall. Not banging, not scratching. A soft tap. Then another. A rhythm. I covered my ears, breath slow, told myself to stay calm. This was a hallucination, sleep deprivation, a lingering echo from Parker's words, from the recordings from the grove. But then I heard something worse. Footsteps. Wooden, measured, slow. Coming up the outer stairs. I stood without thinking, ran to the generator room, locked the inner door. I stood in the dark for what felt like an hour, body rigid, hand on the flare gun. But the footsteps never reached the door. When I finally stepped back into the main room, the fog had receded slightly. Not cleared, just pulled back, enough to see the clearing again. And what stood in it? At least a dozen of them now. Tall, straight, wrong. Their limbs curled downward. Some had split trunks, others bent at the middle like spines. None of them had been there the day before. I opened the emergency map and checked the latest layout. The clearing was supposed to be 80 feet wide. Now it was less than 30. The trees had moved in. They used the fall storm to distract me, to isolate, to advance. Outside, they didn't move again. They didn't need to. Their message was clear. This was no longer a passive haunting, no longer a strange behavior of nature. This was preparation, encroachment, territory being redrawn, and I was inside it. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching those twisted silhouettes stand perfectly still. The fog never fully lifted. The radios didn't come back online. The warning never repeated, and no other station called to check in. It was as if the storm had been broadcast only to me. A private message, a test, and now they were closer. They always got closer. The dreams began soft. A flicker, a shape, the smell of wet bark and cold earth drifting through my sleep like a memory I didn't own. but they grew sharper, clearer, more detailed than waking life. Every night I found myself standing in a forest that looked like Greyside but felt entirely different. The trees pulsed with a faint light from within their trunks, as if sap carried its own kind of moon. The roots twisted, curled, and braided beneath my feet in deliberate patterns. Not random growth, but script, intentional. Writing. I couldn't read it, not at first. But each night I understood a little more. Not with language, with feeling, with instinct. The dreams didn't scare me. They welcomed me. That scared me afterward. Because every morning when I woke, I found traces from those dreams on my body. Dirt beneath my fingernails. Soil on the sheets. Tiny bark fragments on my elbows and forearms. Sometimes sap dried along my wrist like a vein had leaked sweet resin in the night. The skin underneath always tingled, like something had pressed against me while I slept. My clothes smelled of forest floor. I checked the door every morning. Always locked. The windows too. No sign I'd walked outside. But the signs on me said otherwise. By the fourth night, the dreams changed. The forest no longer watched me from afar. It gathered around me. The trees leaned in, just like the grove up north, but without menace. Their limbs formed an arch overhead, a vaulted canopy, a cathedral of wood. The air vibrated softly with a deep resonance, as if the entire forest hummed a word I couldn't hear. I felt something ancient there. Not evil, not kind, just old. Older than language, older than human memory. A consciousness woven through thousands of trunks, hundreds of miles of roots. A network that thought in seasons and centuries rather than moments. In the dream, I wasn't afraid. I felt honored, chosen. Some part of me hated that feeling when I woke. Because each morning, my thoughts were less my own. Something pressed against the edges of them, not invading, not forcing, just suggesting, swaying, like wind pushing a branch until it leaned the way it wanted. And the suggestion grew stronger every day. The forest wanted something. Not my body, not my life, my memory, my mind, identity, names. It didn't want to be unknown anymore. It didn't want to be the nameless presence that hikers feared in silence. It wanted to be called something, recognized, defined, known. At first, I thought I was projecting, filling in the blanks of fear with fantasy. But the dreams kept repeating the same idea, shaping it clearer each time. The forest didn't hate us. It didn't hunt us. It wasn't territorial in the way we understood. It was incomplete. It needed a name. It needed someone to speak it. Someone to anchor it into the world of memory, where things exist because we say they do. I started hearing things while awake. Soft murmurs rising from the floorboards, the walls, the ground beneath the tower. Not words, tones, low vibrations, the same rhythm from the dreams. Sometimes I felt roots against the soles of my feet, even when standing on wood. Sometimes I felt branches brush my shoulders as I walked, even though the nearest tree was 30 feet away. And once, while washing my hands, I looked down and saw soil trickling from my wrists like blood. I scrubbed until the skin reddened. The soil returned the next morning. My reflection started looking wrong. Not dramatically, just slightly. My eyes seemed darker, not in color but in depth, like something behind them watched from far away. My hair felt coarser. My skin itched constantly, as if thin bark was forming beneath the surface. I kept telling myself I needed sleep, food, normalcy. But when I tried to eat, everything tasted like dirt. When I tried to sleep, the dreams pulled me into their orbit instantly, as if I'd never left. One dream stood out. I stood in the grove that watches, The leaning trees formed a circle around me, their roots curled inward, touching the soil like fingers tapping a drum. The ground pulsed once beneath me, and then they spoke, not with voices, with movement, with posture, with presence. The meaning wasn't verbal, but it landed inside me with perfect clarity. Name us. Not a request, not a command, a need, a biological hunger, something ancient and vast reaching outward for definition. I woke gasping, soil coating both palms, pine needles tangled in my hair. I staggered to the sink, splashed water on my face and looked in the mirror. My eyes were darker again, my nails dirt-lined, my veins faintly brown under the skin. My thoughts weren't entirely mine, and the terrifying thing was how natural it felt. Like I wasn't becoming something else, like I was remembering something instead. I opened Parker's journal and read his handwriting again. Slow, shaky, final. They are learning my name. For the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. The forest wasn't absorbing people. It was assimilating them, preparing them, choosing them. We weren't being hunted. We were being invited. And the more it learned your name, the more it whispered its own back into you, trying to take root, trying to grow inside your mind until you spoke it aloud and completed the cycle. The forest wanted a name, and it wanted me to give it one, because I had stayed too long, listened too closely, dreamed too deeply, and now the forest had taken root in me. It happened slowly, not like a switch flipping, more like fog creeping under a door. I didn't notice the binder at first. I'd left it open on the desk, Rule 12 still visible, corners curled from the damp air. But the next time I looked, it was blank. Every page. Same paper, same plastic sleeves. No rules, no map, no emergency codes. Just empty white sheets, stiff with age but smooth and untouched, like the words had never existed. Like they'd never been written at all. I checked my logbook. Same thing. Blank. Even the imprint from my pen had vanished. I reached for my ID badge, clipped beside the radio. The name had faded. Not scratched off. Not erased. Faded like sunlight had washed it away over years. The photo was still there, but even that had blurred. The face looking back at me was vague, just shadows and suggestion, an outline. I whispered my name to myself. The sound came out hesitant. Wrong. Unfamiliar. I tried again, slower. It caught in my throat. No resistance, just absence. Like trying to remember a dream you never had. I turned to the mirror. My reflection didn't help. The features were still mine, technically, but softened, dimmed, hair darker, skin pale. My eyes didn't look like eyes. They looked like deep circles of moss-stained water. And I couldn't tell what I was thinking anymore. Not clearly. Not completely. The thoughts were there, but they weren't shaped like thoughts. They were feelings, patterns, rhythms, roots of language growing in directions I couldn't control. I still walked the patrols, but I didn't log them, didn't plan them. The trees told me where to go. They didn't speak, not in words, but in pressure, in tilt, in the way branches leaned just slightly when I passed, nudging my shoulders gently like a parent guiding a child. I followed without question. Sometimes I'd walk for hours and not realize it. Sometimes I'd blink and be miles from the tower. No memory of the trail. No memory of turning back. But I wasn't afraid anymore. That was the worst part. The fear had melted, dissolved into something calmer. The dread had been replaced with understanding, like when you finally accept an illness is permanent and stop fighting. I didn't feel watched. I felt surrounded, protected, like the forest had wrapped itself around me, not to trap, but to keep. I spoke less. There was no need. Language felt heavy, sharp, it didn't fit anymore. Listening made more sense. Listening to the leaves shifting, to the low hum of soil beneath my feet, to the soft stretching sounds of branches realigning themselves in the dark. There were no birds now, no animals, just me, and the trees, and what lived beneath them. One night, I found myself standing in the center of the grove again. I hadn't planned to go there, but I was there all the same. The trees were closer than before. Their trunks arched into each other like ribs forming a cage. At the center, the ground had changed. A depression now. Soft soil, dark and damp. Big enough for someone to lie down in. I looked at my hands. They were stained with bark, lines where veins should be, my fingertips rough, cracked, my nails dark. I felt no pain, only stillness, only pressure building behind my eyes, like something trying to push outward. A name, not mine, theirs, growing, taking shape, waiting to be spoken. I turned and left without knowing why. The forest allowed it. It wasn't finished yet. It was still writing itself inside me. That night, back in the tower, I found a slip of paper pinned to the wall above my bed. I hadn't put it there. No one else could have. It held a single sentence, handwritten in a looping scrawl that looked half-formed, like roots carving into the surface of wood. You are not forgetting, you are returning. I read it over and over. The words didn't feel foreign. They felt correct. I lay down without undressing, closed my eyes, felt the rhythm of the trees through the floorboards. And I dreamed again. But this time, the trees didn't surround me. They bowed. Their branches curled inward. And they whispered something low, deep, from far beneath the surface. It wasn't my name, but I knew it now. I was no longer in the forest. The forest was in me, and it was almost ready to speak. There's one last rule. It was never in the binder. Parker didn't write it in his journal. It wasn't whispered to me in the grove, or spoken from the trunks, or etched into the clearing floor. But I know it now. It's not something you're told. It's something you become aware of. The rule is this: the forest only takes those who stay too long. And the moment it learns your name, really learns it, not just as sound but as belonging, you begin to forget all the others. Your own. Everyone else's. Even the name of the forest itself, once it speaks it through you, will erase the rest. That's the cost of being chosen. That's the cost of naming something that was never meant to be known. I'm writing this now not as a warning, not even as a record. I know it won't last. The words will fade. The paper will blur. This will join Parker's log and the blank binder and the vanished files. But maybe it will hold long enough. Long enough for me to remember. Long enough to remind myself that I was once someone else. Someone who wore a badge. Someone who spoke their name with confidence. Someone who was sent here to observe, not to serve. I don't know how long I've been here anymore. Time bends around the trees. Days fold into nights without clear division. The fog never fully lifts. The sky never shows the sun for more than a few hours. I wake at strange times and find the sky the same color it was when I fell asleep. I tried marking days on the wall. The lines faded after a week. I carved them into the floor instead. They filled up faster than they should have. Or maybe I just stopped counting. I still walk the patrols, but there are no trails now. The forest has shifted completely. The paths have blurred. The trees move with intent, shaping spaces as needed. There are no fixed coordinates anymore. I move the way it wants me to. It doesn't force me. It guides me. Softly, patiently, lovingly. I can feel the bark beneath my skin now. Not physically, though the surface of my arms has grown rougher, lined with tiny ridges like scars, but deeper. In my thoughts, the way my mind forms now is different, less linear, more rooted. Ideas grow rather than arrive. The roots are coiling around my memories, not choking them, preserving them in their own way. I remember my mother's voice, but I don't remember her name. I remember a fire once, smoke rising against a dawn sky, but I don't remember where. I remember I had a name, but it's gone now. It left quietly, like a bird slipping through open air. And in its place, there is a word I cannot write, a sound I cannot replicate, but I feel it, carved into the center of me like initials in bark. The forest's name, given form through me. That was always the final step. Not transformation, translation. It could never speak on its own. Not directly. It needed a mouth, a memory, a vessel to hold its presence, shape its edges, give it language so it could finally be recognized. And I was here long enough to hear it, long enough to carry it, long enough to belong to it. I see them now. Parker, the woman from Trail 6. Others I never knew by name. They're not gone. They stand among the trees. Not lost. Not dead. Present. Changed. Their eyes are quiet now, still, but not empty. They are part of the rhythm, part of the shape. They move when the forest needs them to. They sleep standing. They breathe with the wind. And soon I will join them. I feel the earth calling now. My legs are heavy. My breath smells like sap. My fingernails split into layers like old wood. There is a hollow waiting in the grove. I don't fear it. I know it was made for me. When I stand in it, I will no longer think in words. I will think in rings, in time, in rain and soil, and the hush of fog curling over pine needles. The forest will finish its name inside me, and the last piece will settle into place. Until then, I sit here, writing this, not as a warning, but as a reminder. If you find this, if you read this, remember what I've forgotten. The rules were never for protection. They were for preparation. Guidelines for becoming part of something larger. Something old. Something aware. The forest does not punish. It accepts. It remembers. And once you stay long enough, so will you.